Back in chapters 4 and 5, we just started our discussion of stock investing. We're going to continue that now by talking about active management. Active management and active investing is the process of picking specific investments such as stocks. And we're going to focus on stocks here because that's the section of the book that we are in. We're talking about stock investing. Stocks will likely provide the greatest source of revenue for you during your life, aside from what you earn from your job. So we really need to understand how it works. And as you invest, you've got some choices. One choice is whether you want to be active with your investing or whether you want to be passive. If you are active, you are picking specific investments, individual stocks, individual bonds. You're saying, look, I think Apple's going to perform well, so there is where I want to invest. And if you choose to go active, you can do that on your own. You can take a self-guided approach. This means that you're picking individual stocks yourself. As you can probably guess, I'm not a big fan of that because I don't think you have any individual skill. I don't think I have any individual skill. I don't think really anyone has any specific skill as an investor. Remember that all the information that we can learn about a company is publicly available. All right, so if I stare at charts all day and research what's going on at Apple, I don't think that benefits me because everyone else can do the same. Okay, but nonetheless, if you do this, at least you'll avoid fees, so maybe it could be worse. Or a really very different approach would be to recognize that you don't have any skill and go out and hire someone. And I'm not going to spend too much time in this class talking about advisors or planners, but I will mention them now. A financial advisor is generally in the game of trying to choose specific investment options. So if you hire a financial advisor, what you're saying here is, take my money and invest it in a way that you think will yield the highest returns. Again, I'm not a big fan of that because I don't think financial advisors have any specific skill. Also, you have to pay them. So even if they do have some skill, they've got to have so much skill that they overcome the fact that you have to pay them. That's tough to do. Or alternatively, you might hire a financial planner. I'm a fan of financial planners. Financial planners provide a holistic approach to guiding you through your financial career. So they're not just looking at which stocks to invest in. They're going to provide investment suggestions, help you with your Social Security elections, help you pick a health insurance plan. They're going to do everything for you. So you might consider hiring a certified financial planner, somebody with a certified financial planning designation, a CFP, has demonstrated that they have skill and they should be operating in your best interest. It's not a bad plan to hire a CFP, but again, if you're watching this video, you probably want to do this stuff on your own, and I think you can. It's not really that hard, okay? As a third approach, you might invest in mutual funds. So with a mutual fund, it's like you're hiring an advisor, but you don't have a one-on-one relationship with them. You're just throwing your money in with a bunch of other people and trying to perform as well as possible. Some mutual funds have trillions of dollars invested, so it's not like you're hiring someone. You're just saying, let me include my money in with that other money that you're investing. A mutual fund is a fund that attempts generally to outperform the markets or a specific benchmark. So if you invest in a mutual fund that only includes tech funds, then effectively you're not trying to beat the entire market, you're just trying to beat the tech sector of the US stock market, okay? But we can really be very general here when we think about mutual funds. Most of them indeed are trying to outperform the market. So what that means is, if in 2024, the market generates a return of 14.5% overall, mutual fund managers are trying to do better than that. They're trying to yield a return that is greater than 14.5%. And even if you're not a fan of mutual funds, you really have to learn how they work. Because in your 401k, for example, what you might find is there's not a lot of investment options, and a mutual fund is the best choice for you. Navigating those choices is really important because small mistakes magnify into financial disasters in the long run. So active management is really generally trying to beat the market. That's a simplification, but that's roughly what it's trying to do. On the other hand, passive management is the choice to really relinquish control and just ride with the market. Passive management is basically the attempt to perform at the market rate of return. I say attempt there, that's probably not a very good choice of words because it's not difficult to perform at the market level of return. All you have to do is invest in index funds. So if you invest in a total U.S. stock market index fund, you're buying the entire U.S. stock market and you're just saying, look, give me the 14.5% return. I'm happy with that. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about active investing, and then in chapter 7, we'll circle back on passive management. Now, as the title of this chapter suggests, active management doesn't perform very well. And I hope you don't think that this is like my personal bias or something showing. No, this is just based on historical research. If we look at the performance of mutual funds or financial advisors, it's crap. They perform very, very poorly compared to the market as a whole. And there are a few key reasons why that is the case. And really what I'm focusing on here is mutual funds. All right, that's our target here, is to discuss mutual funds. And then we'll compare mutual funds to index funds, which are the types of investments that hopefully you see in your 401k, and certainly you should see in your IRA and other accounts like that. So the first and foremost reason why active management fails is fees. When you invest in a mutual fund, which is actively managed, you have to pay fees, okay? And there's a few here that we're going to talk about. I'm not going to bury the lead. I'm going to hit you with the most common type of fee and also the one that you should worry about the most. It's called an expense ratio. And even if you invest passively, you're still going to run into plenty of expense ratios, okay? If you invest in a total stock market index fund, you still got to pay something for them to give you that option to invest. Expense ratios is normally how this is provided to the investor. This is the way those fees are expressed. So for example, you might see an expense ratio of 0.5%. We need to understand what that means, okay? Because this right here is one of the most important topics that we're going to cover in this entire class. Expense ratios really hurt you in the long run. So what this expense ratio means is every year they're going to collect, the mutual fund manager is going to collect 0.5% of the value of your account. All right? Now that might not sound like a lot, but if you leave your money in there for, let's say, 30 years, 0.5% every 30 years is a lot of money. And furthermore, it's going against the compounding nature of investment. So for example, if they take $50 out of your account today, they're not just taking $50 out of your account. They're taking all of the growth that would have happened with that $50 in the future. And this can be pretty easily shown to you mathematically of how damaging this can be. If you have no fee, and let's say you take a $100,000 investment for 30 years, and you earn a 10% return, let's think about where we would be in the future. This is our basic time value of money calculation that we've seen in the past. $100,000 would be our present value. 1 plus the interest rate here. The interest rate is 10%. Remember, the stock market on average returns about 10% annually in the United States. We do that for 30 years. That money would turn into about $1.7 million. So without any fees, a 10% return over 30 years, that's how much we would be left with. Now let's assume you have a 0.5% expense ratio, which isn't even that high. All right, when you open up your 401k package when you're employed, what you're going to see is most expense ratios are significantly higher than that. Hopefully you've got some that are below 0.5%, but you may find that all of them are above 0.5%. And I'll show you how damaging this can be. Let's assume you have the same investment, $100,000, but now you have a 0.5% expense ratio. From a standpoint of this class, the math is really easy. All we need to do is subtract off that expense ratio here. Okay? So a 10% return feels like a 9.5% return once you consider this expense ratio. So the assumption I'm making is we're still going to generate a 10% return on the assets in our account, but we have to lose 0.5% due to that fee. Okay? So I invest $100,000, $500 just goes away, it evaporates due to those fees. This is the way I can show that mathematically. Okay? So my 10% return turns into a 9.5% return. Okay, now make sure subtracting off 0.005, that is 0.5%, right? So that right there is the 9.5% return that we get when we consider the 10% return negated by that 0.5% expense ratio. Okay? So after 30 years of investing, how much money do we have? Here's what you should find. And you can see how much that 0.5% adds up over the course of your lifetime. All right? If a scenario were to present itself just like this, choosing the one with the 0.5% expense ratio, see how large of a mistake that could be? That's a more than $200,000 mistake. And as we'll learn, it's even worse than that. Because truth be told, mutual funds actually perform worse than the market even when you ignore fees, on average. Now, there's some mutual funds that do great, but which ones are going to do great? We don't know. It's all really quite random. So the average mutual fund generates less than 10% return annually, and then you have to pay fees on top of that. And so the choice of choosing a mutual fund over a similar index fund could cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of your life. Expense ratios really damaging, okay? And that's one you should very much pay attention to when you're choosing your investments. But it's not the only thing. In addition to expense ratios, you might find some funds that have front-end load fees. Sometimes these are called purchasing fees. Sometimes they're called sales load. They can have a lot of different names. But these front-end load fees charge you a set amount of money at the time of deposit based on the amount that you put in. Okay? So for example, let's say you had a 5% front-end load fee. That means that for every dollar that you contribute to the mutual fund manager is going to collect 5 cents right at the time of deposit. Now, 5% is a lot more than the 0.5% that we discussed here, but this is actually less problematic for a long-term investor because you only have to pay it once. I'd rather pay a 5% fee once than pay a 0.5% fee many times over as a long-term investor. So let's again use the same example we had before. You invest $100,000 for 30 years, 10% return. Let's see what happens. The fee that you would have to pay right at the beginning is the $5,000 front-end load fee. And you can see how I solve for that. It's very simple, right? $100,000 gets contributed into the fund. 5% is collected by the fund managers. That's a $5,000 fee. So when we solve for the future value of this account, we need to subtract off the $5,000, right? When we invest, we only invest $95,000 because $5,000 just goes away right at the beginning. So after 30 years, the amount of money that we would have in this account is about $1.65 million. That amount right there. And you can see compared to option A, the expense ratio, the 0.5% expense ratio was much more damaging to us as a long-term investor. So these front-end load fees, they absolutely do matter, but they're generally not as problematic as expense ratios for the long-term investor, right? Now, what would be the stupidest thing to do here would be to choose the front-end load fee as a short-term investor. You know, imagine you contribute $100,000 to this account and then tomorrow you take the money back out. You would pay the $5,000 fee and it would just be $5,000 gone like that. So as a short-term investor, this would be incredibly problematic, okay? Now, which of these are more common? The expense ratios. Maybe I'm cynical, but I think that investment firms know that the average investor doesn't really understand how expense ratios work. And that's a good way to charge people and charge them again and again and again. An expense ratio is like a subscription service. You just have to keep paying it over and over. As a third and final common type of fee that you'll see, a back-end load fee. And this one is pretty straightforward also. A back-end load fee just means you pay the fee at the end instead of at the beginning, okay? So for example, you might have a 5% back-end load fee. And it turns out that the impact of a back-end load fee is exactly the same as the impact of a front-end load fee. And that's because 5% of any amount of money is going to be the same whether we take it out at the beginning or at the end. Okay, and you can prove this to yourself mathematically, and indeed I do that in the book. So if you invest $100,000 for 30 years, you're going to have, again, that $1.7 million. That would be the same as if we had no fee. But when you go to sell that account, you will then pay a 5% fee. So you will get to keep 95% of your investment, and 5% of it will go away to the fund manager. And what you would find is after you pay that 5% fee, the remaining balance in your account is exactly the same as paying a 5% front-end load fee. So apples to apples, if you have a 2% front-end load fee and a 2% back-end load fee, and you're going to hold either of those accounts for 10 years, the impact is exactly the same. Okay? Now, what you'll find to make things even more complex is that mutual funds will mix and match. They won't just have one of these fees, they'll have multiple of them. A real common one is to have a front-end load fee and an expense ratio. So that means you have to pay it twice. So just as a real quick example, you might invest in a fund that has a 0.8% expense ratio and a 6% front-end fee. If you invest $10,000 into this account, you're going to immediately lose 6% right off the bat. So $600 is going to go away, and that means you have $9,400 that actually gets invested. Assuming you get the regular 10% return over a long period of investing, then this is what the math would look like. Let's say again over 30 years. Okay? You can see the $600 went away. That affected our present value. And then the expense ratio here affects our return, our interest rate. Okay? And again, if we're talking about a long-term investor, the expense ratio is the more problematic investment here. Because the 6% we only pay once, but the 0.8% we pay 30 times. So that's a much more problematic fee. Fees aren't the only issue though. So fees are a big problem, but they're only a portion of the problems that arise from active management. In addition to fees, investors using active management spend some time out of the market. And this is less obvious. You know, fees, you can see the fees, they're tangible. Time out of the market is a little bit more obscure. Let's think about why, okay? First of all, let's think about a passive investor. Somebody who invests all of their money in a total U.S. stock market. That person is investing nearly 100% of their money all of the time. because the passively managed fund managers, they don't need to do anything. All they need to do is make sure all of your money is invested, and they get almost all of it invested, okay? The only small difference is, there might be a 0.2% or something that they hold in cash simply because they have to move some money around. But people passively investing get just about all their money invested. Active managers, though, they're making moves. They're trying to sell things, they're trying to buy things, and that leads to time out of the market. For example, a mutual fund manager might decide that Nike is not going to perform well in the next month, so they're going to sell their Nike position. Maybe for a minute, maybe for several days. After they sell that Nike stock, they now have got cash on hand that is not invested. Okay? And the impact of that can be really large. For example, imagine an actively managed fund spends 5% of the time out of the market. And that can manifest itself in a couple different ways. Maybe 5% of the money invested in that account is out of the market all of the time. So maybe only 95% of the money is invested. Or alternatively, maybe 5% of the time that mutual fund is completely out of the market. There's various ways this could look. But the bottom line is, if you're out of the market 5% of the time, you're missing out on returns. The expected return in the stock market based on historical data is 10%. If you're losing 5% of that 10%, then your return is going to be 5% less than that. Okay? So instead of generating a 10% return, you would generate a 9.5% return. Now, the assumption I'm making there is that these managers don't have any skill. That they're going out of the market not because it's a good idea to go out of the market, but because they're just doing stuff, right? They're just randomly buying and selling because they don't know what the hell's going on. That's really my view of most of these active fund managers. I think they think they're trying to do things, but the data show that they don't have any skill. So to me, them moving money around is just a lot of hand waving. It's a lot of smoke and mirrors. It's to make it look like they have skill. Okay, so if they're out of the market 5% of the time, they've got to overcome the fact that they're going to perform worse than the market as a result of that. And that's tough to do. Okay? Furthermore, in addition to time out of the market, there's a concern of risk. Now, risk doesn't directly connect to return. Risk does not inherently create return or eliminate return. But I think most people who invest would prefer less risk. So let's imagine you're going to invest all of your money in the stock market and you want to do it with as little risk as possible. Pretty much the best way to do that would be to invest in the total U.S. stock market, and you can do that passively invested in a total stock market fund. Now I'm assuming here that we're just going to invest in just the U.S. You could do this with international stocks too. Passive management allows you to buy all the stocks. You can't be any more diversified than holding all of the stocks, right? So active management inherently has to be a deviation away from that. If the least risk you can generate is by holding all of the stocks, a decision to hold less than all of the stocks is always going to be riskier. So mutual funds are inherently riskier. Now, you maybe have been trained to think, more risk means more return, but not in this case, okay? In this case, we know that mutual funds perform worse than the market overall. So you're taking on more risk to underperform the market when you invest in a typical mutual fund. It's kind of hard to come, to justify that, at least in my eyes. If none of that makes sense, then let me just give you kind of a parting bit of wisdom here to understand why mutual funds fail to beat the market. If the market returns 10% historically, how will passively invested funds perform? Well, passive performance, passively invested funds are there just to perform at the market level. So if I invest in a total stock market fund and the market returns 10%, my performance is going to be at 10% as well, at least before fees, and passive funds generally charge very, very small fees. Okay? So if the market as a whole is generating a 10% return, my passively invested fund is also going to generate a 10% return. Well, there's only two groups of people that are invested. There are the active investors and the passive investors. If the passive investors are performing at the market average, then mathematically, the active investors also have to perform at the market average. Mathematically has to be true, right? If half the market is generating an average return, then the other half of the market also has to be generating an average return in terms of what they're investing in. But then we can start making deductions beyond that. If you're investing in mutual funds, you have greater fees, which are going to eat away at that return. And you have time out of the market. So, by nature, mathematically, passively invested index funds, mathematically, they have to perform the average mutual fund. They have to, right? If both are returning 10% before fees, then the one with more fees has to generate a lower return for the investor. It's a mathematical fact. And I'm not telling you anything new here. This is not something I'm making up. It's borne out by the data, and you can listen to people like Warren Buffett who have said exactly the same type of things I'm talking about here. The average actively managed fund performs worse than the market, and it does so with excess risk. And in the chapter, the textbook, I go into much greater detail. You should check that out, freefinancebook.com. Chapter 6, I give you lots of data, lots of information about this so that you can kind of see where this information I'm providing is coming from. You know, I'm not just making it up. And one of the things I do there near the end of the book is I just show you the percent of mutual funds that beat the market. Over a 5-year horizon, only about 9.6% of mutual funds beat the market. So the other 90% perform worse than the market. If we use longer time horizons, it becomes even more devastating. Over a 10-year period, only 3.6% of mutual funds beat the market. Now, what can we take away from this? There's a couple of arguments we can make. One argument could say, well, maybe these people are just lucky. That there are some people who just get lucky and beat the market. Or alternatively, maybe there are some people who have skill and are able to beat the market. My view as an academic is this discussion is a moot point. Unless I have some way of figuring out which mutual funds are going to perform better than the market, there's no way for me to figure out a way to invest in the ones that are really good. Over a 10-year period, if there are 100 mutual fund managers, about 96 are going to underperform the market and about 4 are going to beat the market. I don't like those odds. I would rather just perform at the market average than take the chances of the 3.6% odds that I'm going to choose the mutual fund that happens to outperform the market. So my view on this is really quite simple. I think the financial industry, again, there's smoke and mirrors there. There's a lot of jargon. There's a lot of things that are needlessly complicated because it is in the interest of the financial industry for you to think things are complicated so that you hire a mutual fund manager, so that you'll hire a financial advisor. But I don't think skill is possible in this day and age, or at least it's really hard to find. Okay, there are indeed some managers out there that have found a way to beat the market. But most of those don't allow you to invest your money. They've closed off their funds where they're not accepting any more contributions. So it's going to become increasingly difficult to pick mutual funds. Do people have skill? Do financial experts understand the stock market? Yeah, they understand it very well. They understand it better than I do. The problem is understanding it doesn't generate any value because everyone has the opportunity to do the same research. We can all stare at the same charts. We can all read the same news report. Since we all have the same information, there's no way to take advantage of that information. So that's chapter 6. In chapter 7, we're going to talk about passive investing in greater detail. It'll be a pretty easy chapter that we'll be able to get through faster than this one.